Hello, in this lecture I will discuss about parasitism in details. So let us revise that what we have learned from our previous lectures. We have said that parasitism is an interaction between two species where one of the species is getting benefited and other species is getting harmed. So let us imagine over here the two species, species A and species B. And from their interaction, one species A is getting advantageous or benefited and species B is getting harmed. So the depiction of parasitism we have written as plus and minus. So I hope that you remember what is this plus and minus. Now, the species A, which is actually benefited from this parasitic interaction, is called a parasite. So from this interaction, the which species is getting benefited is called a parasite. The species B, which is getting harmed, is called the host. So hope you have understood this part till now. So what I have said that in parasitism, two species are getting interacted. One of the species is getting advantage or one of the species is getting benefited, which is called a parasite. The other species which is not getting the benefit or actually getting the harm is called the host. Now, normally the parasite is smaller in size as compared to the host. Now, depending on the type of interaction between a parasite and a host, depending on the size of the parasite, depending on the characteristics of the parasite, this parasite can be classified into different types. Now, we will learn all these different types in this lecture. So let us start with these different types of parasites so that we will understand this topic in more details. I have said that on the basis of size, parasites can be classified as microparasites or macroparasites. Now, let us see the difference between the microparasites and macroparasites. From the name itself, it is understood that microparasite means these are the parasites which are relatively smaller in size. The name micro means small. And macroparasite on the other hand means that these are the parasites which are relatively larger in size. Okay, so you can also differentiate between these two types of parasites by that those parasites which can be observed by the normal vision, by the normal naked eye, can be considered as macroparasites. Similarly, those parasites which are observed under microscope or cannot be observed by the normal naked eye is called microparasites. So simply, microparasites are those parasites which are relatively smaller in size and require a microscope and to observe, and macroparasites are relatively larger in size which can be observed by normal vision. Okay, so this two differentiation is there. So this is a differentiation between a micro and a macroparasite, but this is not the only differentiating factor between a microparasites and macroparasites. There are other different characters also. For example, microparasites require or microparasites have short generation time and macroparasites have longer generation time. Now, what is generation time? Generation time is the time needed to complete one generation. Means you can also define generation time by that it is the average interval between the birth of an individual and birth of its offspring. Means you can say that there is a parasite, and when this parasite divides or it multiplies into its offsprings, that time. So microparasites have generally short generation time. So they multiplies very quickly. As compared to the macroparasites, they have a longer generation time. So this is the second differentiating factors. Microparasites have short generation time while macroparasites have a longer generation time. The third differentiating factor is that microparasites generally replicate within the host. So once this microparasite goes into the host, it can replicate within the host. But macroparasites have special transmission states. They have special transmission states between the hosts. That means what? Suppose this is one host and this is a second host. So suppose this host is infected with the macroparasites. So these macroparasites, when infecting the other host, there will be a special state. It can be any other special state which is outside the host. Then this special state will infect the other host. For example, see, suppose a person A has a parasite. So once this person A, from a person A, the person B is getting infected. Suppose this is person B, it is getting infected. So from this person A to person B, there will be some in between stages, special transmission state between the host. But in case of microparasite, what happens? It generally replicates within the host and is present within the host. So there is no special transmission states. Seldom you will find these special transmission states within the host. Okay. Now the fourth differentiating factor is that microparasites have short duration of infection. Once infected, the microparasite have this short duration of infection. The duration of the infection is very short, while once infected with a macroparasite, there is persistence reinfection in the host. So there is the persistence reinfection is taking place within the host. So there is a continuation, the reinfection will occur within the host itself once it is infected. Okay, so some examples of microparasites, we have viruses, bacteria, protozoa. All these are the small organisms and they are microscopic, and these organisms are considered as microparasites. Macroparasites are relatively larger: helminths, lice, leech, mites, which can be observed through the naked vision, is called the macroparasites. So I hope you have understood the difference between microparasites and macroparasite. Now we'll look at some other classification of parasites. Parasites can be found either on the outside of the host's body, or parasites can be found inside the host body. So depending where the parasites are found or where the parasites actually live, depending on that, parasites can be classified as ectoparasites or as endoparasites. So ectoparasites are those parasites which are found, they are found on outside. They are found outside the host's body. So they are found on the outside of the host body. For example, ticks, then lice. So all these parasites are on the surface. They live on the surface. For example, the head louse, the lice, they remain on the surface, on the skin, on the scalp of where the hair is present. So depending on that, they are present on the surface. Certain ticks are found on the surface of certain animals. So they are always outside the surface of the host. So they are called as ectoparasites. Similarly, there are parasites which are always found inside the body of the host. So the parasites which are found inside the host's body they are called the endoparasites. Now, you have to remember one thing. Inside the host body mean it can be any organ, any tissue, but it should be inside the body. It can be the digestive system. It can be the RBCs. It can be any other tissue. It can even be the brain. So parasites can enter, the parasites which are called as endoparasites, they can go inside the body and they survive there. So those type of parasites which go inside the body of the host, they are found inside the body of the host, they are called the endoparasites. So ectoparasites are those parasites which survive on the outside. Endoparasites are those parasites which are inside the body of the host. The examples of the endoparasites, example, there are hookworms, there are roundworms. So all these are parasites are present inside. The plasmodium, these are present inside the body. So I hope you have understood what is ectoparasites and what is endoparasites. Now, depending on the relationship with the host, parasites are also classified. Means how a parasite depends, or its dependency or its relation with the host, parasites can also be classified. We'll see those now. Okay, now let me explain the parasitic dependency on host. Now what does that mean? So I have said you that parasite and host are in a symbiotic relationship. That means what? The parasites and the host, they remain in close association, and the parasite gets benefited from this interaction and the host does not get the benefit, or the host is actually getting harmed. Now the parasites, they depend on the host for its either nutrition, for its completing its life cycle, or even getting a shelter. So depending on how the parasite depends on the host, the parasites can be classified as obligate parasites, or it can be called as facultative parasites. Now let me explain what is an obligate parasite. Now first let me explain what is about obligate parasites. Obligate parasites are those parasites which require the host to complete its life cycle. Means, let me write down. So it requires the host to complete its life cycle. What does this mean? This means that these obligate parasites cannot survive without the existence of its host. Means a parasite which always requires the host for its survival is called an obligate parasite. Now let me give an example. This example I have also used for some other modes of parasitism. Plasmodium. The plasmodium or the malarial parasite, it cannot survive or it cannot complete its life cycle outside the host. Either it requires mosquito or it requires a human. So it actually requires mosquito as well as the human for its survival. So it cannot survive without the hosts. So therefore this type of parasites like plasmodium is called an obligate parasites. So you should know this, that this has come from as an evolution perspective. From the evolution, as the evolution of the host happened, similarly the evolution of the parasites also took place, and together now is the situation that these parasites, these obligate parasites cannot survive or cannot complete its life cycle without the host itself. So I hope you have understood this obligate parasites. In simple terms, these parasites requires the host for its survival, or it requires the host for its existence, or it requires the host to complete its life cycle. Example is plasmodium. Now let us talk about facultative parasites. Facultative parasites are those parasites which does not require the host for its survival. First point, it does not require the host. I'll write it down. It does not require hosts for its survival. That means what? That means it can live freely. That means it can survive freely without the host. But then how come this is a parasite? These parasites sometimes does parasitic activities. So I'll write it down that over here also, that it's sometimes perform parasitic activities. Now, for example, there are certain roundworms. The roundworms, they can survive freely, but they sometimes they invade humans. They go inside the human bodies, they reside in the human tissues, and they cause certain disease. They sometimes become parasitic. So they can live freely on their own. But what happens, together with that, they sometimes do some parasitic activity. Sometimes they become parasites. So those type of parasites which can live without the host, which can survive without the host, but sometimes do parasitic activities, they are called facultative parasites. Okay, one example I will give you, one type of roundworms which is called Strongyloides stercoralis. This is a generic name, this is a species name. Strongyloides stercoralis is a roundworm. This roundworm can live freely, but sometimes it infects humans and causes a disease which is called, I'll write this disease over here. It causes a disease which is called strongyloidosis. Strongyloidiasis. So it causes a disease. So these parasites can live freely without the host, but sometimes do some parasitic activities. So I hope you have understood this. This is very, very important, because in further lectures, when I will take one example of a parasite and talk about its complete life cycle, how it lives within the host. So at that time I will mention this, that this parasite is an obligate parasite. At that time you should remember this, that obligate parasite means it will require the host for its survival. If I tell you that, okay, this parasite is a facultative parasite, at that time you have to tell me that, okay, that time you should remember this, that, okay, those parasites are facultative parasites means what? It can survive on its own, but it requires the host. At some times, it may become parasitic. Okay, I think now this has been completed. So till now what I have talked about? I have talked about microparasites. What are microparasites? What are macroparasites? Then I have talked about the ectoparasites and endoparasites. Now I have told you what are obligate parasites and what are facultative parasites. Plasmodium is a microparasite. Plasmodium is an endoparasite. Plasmodium is also an obligate parasite. Okay, so if someone tells you about, okay, tell me about Plasmodium, then you can say, okay, Plasmodium is an endoparasite, it's a microparasite, it's an obligate parasite. Okay, so I hope till now you have understood what is this obligate parasite and facultative parasites. Now parasites can also be classified into some other forms, and let me talk about those forms first, then we'll move on to the what are hosts. Okay, so first let me talk about some different other forms of parasites, or the other types of how the parasites are also classified as. Okay, so let us talk about those first, then we'll go on to we'll talk about the hosts. Okay, now let us discuss about some other types in which parasites can be classified. The first one, let us talk about monogenic parasites. So some parasites require only one host to complete its life cycle. Those parasites are called monogenic parasites. So monogenic parasites are those parasites which require only one host to complete its life cycle. Those are called monogenic parasites. Some parasites may require two hosts to complete its life cycles. So some parasites may require two hosts to complete its life cycles. For example, Plasmodium, it requires mosquito as a host as well as human as a host. So Plasmodium is a digenetic parasite. So it requires two hosts. That's why it is called digenetic parasites. Monogenic parasite means it requires only one host to complete its life cycle. Digenetic parasite means it requires two hosts to complete its life cycle. Now, a very interesting type of parasites or type of parasitism is called epiparasitism. Epiparasitism or epiparasites are those parasites which live on other parasites. Now, this is very unique. I'll give an example and so that it will be clear. For example, there is a dog and there is a parasite of this dog which is a flea. So, a flea or a small insect is a parasite. So, this is a parasite and it is a parasite of the dog. Okay, so over here you understood this. Dog is the host and flea, which is a parasite, it survives or it takes nourishment from the host. So flea is a parasite of the dog. Now there are some protozoans. I write over here. There are some protozoans which is the parasite of the flea. So this is a parasite of the flea itself. So this protozoan is a parasite of another parasite. So it is called an hyperparasite. Remember, it is called hyperparasite or a secondary parasite, or it is also called a secondary parasite. That means it is a parasite and it survives on or it feeds on another parasite. So it is called an hyperparasite. So epiparasitism is a very unique phenomena or unique type of parasitism where a parasite is a parasite of another parasite. So dog's parasite is a flea and this protozoa is a parasite of that flea. Okay, so it's a hyperparasite, or it is this type of parasitism is called hyperparasitism, or it's some called epiparasitism. Okay, I think you have understood this. So monogenic parasites requires only one host. Digenic parasites require two hosts. Epiparasitism means a parasite of a parasite. Okay, I'll write down because this you should remember this. I use over here. Epiparasitism, it means a parasite of a parasite. So it's a parasite of a parasite. Okay. Now we'll come to a very unique type of parasitism, and you also know about this parasitism. It is called about brood parasitism. Now what is brood parasitism? Whenever I talk about brood parasitism, it means we are talking about raising young ones. Now I think you should know this, that the Asiatic quail or the quail bird, Asiatic quail bird, it do not lay its egg in its own nest. The Asiatic quail bird lays its egg in some other bird's nest, mostly in a crow's nest. So this Asiatic quail bird, they do not make their nest. So when they want to lay their eggs, they lay the eggs into a crow's nest. Okay, so there are different types of birds. Many birds, they do this type of parasitism. Why I am calling this a parasitism? Because they are not eating food of other birds. They are not killing those other birds. But what they are doing, they are laying eggs in other birds' nest. And that other bird, what they are doing, they think that those are also its own egg. And they are hatching those eggs. They are raising their young ones. So this quail bird is not doing anything for raising their young ones. The other bird is doing it. For example, I'll write it over here. I'll use this part itself. So this for brood parasitism. So I have species A, let us say. This is quail bird, and a species B. This is the crow. Quail bird, it lays its eggs in this crow's nest. The crow thinks, okay, these are my eggs as well, because in the crow's nest there are some eggs of the crow as well, but the crow cannot distinguish between that, and it hatches all the eggs together and it feeds the eggs. It raises its young ones. The quail bird is not doing anything for raising its young one. It is only laying its eggs and its responsibility is over. The crow raises both its own egg, its own small birds, young ones, as well as the quail's young ones. And ultimately, crow is using all the nourishment, it's flying there, picking up some insects, it's feeding those, doing all those things. And ultimately raising the quail's bird, its quail's young one as well. So this is a type of parasitism. Over here, the quail is getting the benefit. It is not wasting its energy to raise a young one. But raising young ones means it is not feeding the young ones, it is not caring for protecting the young ones. So all this energy is not wasted in that. Crow is getting harmed. Harmed means what? It is losing its energy in protecting the young ones of quail as well. It is losing its energy in feeding the quail's young ones as well. So over here, the quail is getting the benefit. So this type of parasitism, where you can see in many birds, the cow birds are there. They are also the brood parasites. You can say that they lay their eggs in some other birds. Over here, you can see a picture where a cow bird lays its egg in some other bird's nest. Okay, so these type of parasites, brood parasitism, you can see in different types of animal kingdom. Mostly in birds, it is quite obvious you see those types of brood parasitism. Now, so I think I have talked about all the different types of parasites. So parasites are there, and parasites are classified based on its size, based on its character, based on where it is present, based on its relation with the host. So based on all those different types, parasites are classified. Now I will talk about the hosts. What are hosts? And hosts are also classified on some aspects or some basics. So we'll talk about the hosts now. Okay, in parasitism, the important thing is that it's an interaction between a parasite and the host, which are the two different species which are interacting. Till now, we have discussed about the parasites and the different types in which the parasites can be classified. We have talked about macroparasite and microparasite. Then we have talked about the endo and ectoparasites. We have talked about the obligate and facultative parasites. Then we have talked about epiparasites or epiparasitism, as well as the brood parasitisms. We have also talked about the monogenic and the digenetic parasites. Now, let me explain a little bit about the hosts as well. The hosts are also classified or can be classified based on where the life cycle of the parasites is taking. Let me give an example and explain this so that it will be clear to you. The host can be classified as definitive hosts. Definitive host. What do you mean by definitive host? The host in which the parasite becomes adult, or you can say the host in which the parasite becomes sexually mature. That host is called the definitive host. So the host in which the parasites, they become adult or they become sexually mature. that host is called the definitive host. So that they can now do the next generation, they can now reproduce, or they can now divide to make more parasites. So that host where the parasite becomes adult or they become sexually mature, that host is called the definitive host. For example, the filarial parasite, which causes filaria, the human is the definitive host of that filaria parasite, the Wucheria bancrofti. So that filarial parasite, the human is the definitive host. Now let us talk about the second type of host, which is called the intermediate host. Intermediate hosts are those organisms or those hosts where the parasites spends its life cycle but not the adult phase, you can say that. So it is an environment, or it is the host where the parasite spends some of its stages of its life cycle in the intermediate host. So we can write down over here some stages of life cycle of parasite. So the parasite remains in the intermediate host where it may spend some of its stage of its life cycle. So that host where the parasite is there and it's spending some stages of its life cycle, that is called the intermediate host. So definitive host where it becomes adult or sexually mature, intermediate host, some stages of life cycle that spent in the intermediate host. Now there is also a type of host. The host can also be classified as reservoir host. Reservoir hosts are those hosts, these are infected organisms. Reservoir hosts are infected organisms which now becomes a source for infection to other organisms. These reservoir hosts are the infected hosts which now become the source of infection to other organisms. Let me give an example of the reservoir host. In Malaysia, the filaria is caused by the filarial parasite and it infects the human as well as the monkeys as well as cats. So the cats and the monkeys, they have infection in them, the filarial parasite in them, and they become the reservoir host, and from there the infection is spread to humans. So you can say, understand this. So cats, I'll use, and monkeys, they become the reservoir. They are infected with the parasite and they become the reservoir, means they become the store or the source of this infection. From here the infection is spread to humans. So you can understand the examples of this reservoir host. Now, so as parasites are classified into different types of parasites, hosts are also classified. Definitive host, intermediate host, reservoir host. Now, why I have mentioned about all these hosts and the types of parasite? Now in the further lectures, now we'll take one parasite as example and we'll talk about its life cycle, we'll talk about its host, how the infection is spread. Okay, so at that time, while talking at that time, all these different terms will be useful. At that time, if I say, okay, this parasite is an obligate parasite, that means you should now think that, okay, obligate parasite means what? Obligate parasite means it requires the host for its survival. So after that, after you know all these terms, now you should, while reading a chapter from the book or while listening to some other videos where it is getting explained that, okay, this parasite is an obligate parasite, this parasite is a facultative parasite, at that time you should be clear that okay, what terms, this term means what. Okay, so I think you have understood today's lectures. I have talked about different types of parasites and I have talked about different types of hosts. I hope this lecture is helpful. Thank you.